Our next speaker is Jan David Hauck from the Department of Anthropology, and his talk is entitled Making Language: Indigenous Experiences of Language Change in Lowland South America.
Throughout the world, there's anxiety about how languages are changing. Some are worried that their language isn't being used purely and properly. Others fear their language will become obsolete. But could it be that our fears are the result of our limited ways we think about language? And could those ways of thinking be even contributing to language demise? As a linguistic anthropologist, I study language change, combining the expertise of linguists who look at words and grammar with that of anthropologists who look at social and cultural contexts. Linguistic anthropology analyzes how language relates to the contexts in which it is used, to the speaker's identity, culture, and history. Since social and cultural changes impact the way people speak, linguistic anthropology is particularly well suited to study language change. In my dissertation, I study language change among the Aché, a small indigenous group from eastern Paraguay. Up until the 1970s, the Aché were nomadic hunter-gatherers living in the dense subtropical rainforests. The dramatic destruction of over 90% of their forests, virgin soil epidemics, and persecutions by Paraguayan colonists forced them to give up their way of life. Those who survived now live in small villages in the middle of large soybean plantations spread over the area that once was their home. These dramatic social and cultural changes led to a rapid decline of their heritage language, which is slowly being replaced by the national language Guarani. Now, Paraguay is a bilingual country with Spanish and Guarani as official languages, and while Spanish is mostly spoken in the cities, it is Guarani that is the dominant language on the countryside where the Aché live now. Since 2008, I have been working with the Aché as part of a team to document their language. We recorded the stories, songs, and cultural practices of the elders. Since they did not have a written tradition, and since traditional means of passing their knowledge on were no longer practiced, this was the only way that future generations would still be able to access the words of their ancestors. For my dissertation research, I returned to the Aché, but this time I set my camera at the children, precisely to understand why they no longer speak their heritage language. I lived with them for a year and recorded hundreds of hours of video and analyzed the language practices involved in children's play, at home, at school, and on hunting treks to the forest. What I found was they did not completely give up their heritage language, but were mixing it with the Guarani language instead. And since Guarani is already heavily influenced by Spanish, the other official language, they were essentially mixing three languages. Now, parents and teachers complained about it. But such mixing of languages might sound familiar to us. For instance, Spanglish might come to mind. From research on immigrant communities, we know that they don't mix languages because they couldn't learn them right or because they don't know them, but because mixing the languages best expresses who they are, belonging simultaneously to two cultures. Unlike immigrant communities, the Aché never left. A dominant alien culture invaded their home. However, their situation is comparable, since they now also must contend with belonging to two cultures. And mixing the Aché language with those of the Paraguayans best expresses that fact. So, we can't expect the kids to speak the language their grandparents spoke while they were still living in the forest. But in fact, this language itself, the language that the grandparents spoke, that we documented in the documentation project, research has shown that it is the result of mixing two indigenous languages long before the first white people ever set foot into their forests. And if we look at how other languages have evolved, this is not uncommon. About 30% of English words are of French origin. Another 30% come from Latin. Spanish is greatly influenced by Arabic. It would be very strange if languages did not exchange words when they are in contact. In German, my native language, my generation has a tendency to use a lot of English words, and it freaks out our parents. Now, if language mixing is so ubiquitous, why is it so unsettling to so many people? Because our notion of language is flawed. If we think about languages as discrete, unchanging entities out in the world, the only thing we can say is that our kids are using them improperly, and that small languages like Aché slowly die as they become obsolete. We would never get over our anxiety about language change, but we also wouldn't understand how languages have evolved in the first place. Now, let's set aside that belief in languages as pre-existing in a certain form. Instead, let's look at the children's practices as something new, and we will see that they've created something unique and special to them which best expresses who they are. Looking at how people actually use language opens up many possibilities for appreciating the creativity and versatility of the human genius, because the way we think about language impacts the way we perceive it. And the genius of the Aché children didn't just stop at language mixing. My data reveals that oftentimes they were switching back into the other languages, into Aché, into Guarani, and even into Spanish while they were playing. Interestingly, when talking to me, they would switch into Aché, into a purer version of Aché, since they knew me from before as someone who was recording the way their grandparents spoke. This shows that the Aché children are highly aware of the different linguistic codes around them and know when to use them. It's clear that they don't just mix languages because they don't know any better. Now, if we would tell them, as some teachers actually do, the way you speak is wrong, you shouldn't mix, it would make them insecure and most likely lead them to give up their language, not in favor of a purer version of Aché, but in favor of Guarani or Spanish. Mixing is the only way the Aché still use and continue to learn some of their heritage language. They preserve many of its words and its sounds. If they no longer used that, they would not learn Aché in any capacity. So thinking about language the wrong way can be actually very dangerous when trying to maintain a language. Trying to preserve it in its pure form might accelerate its death. Changing contexts force people like the Aché to invent new ways of expressing themselves. And what I found is that if we hold on too tight to a false ideal of language as pure and unchanging, by thinking this way, we are contributing to its demise. We must change the way we look at language. I believe we must embrace the fact that it is an ever-changing practice, and purity is not the measure of authenticity. What we can learn from the Aché is that despite the dramatic social and cultural changes that they've had to endure, they still maintain a distinct way of expressing themselves that is uniquely theirs. And while it is not the original Aché language, in some way it keeps them connected to their ancestors and helps them remember where they come from.